Welcome everybody to Module 1 of the Behavior course. In this module, we'll talk a little bit about behavioral theory and give you an introduction to how we think about observing and measuring behavior before we dive into the specific interventions that we'll cover in this course. Before we get started, I want to just acknowledge the contributions of lots of people to the development of these materials. The bulk of the materials that we'll present in this course have been developed by members of the classroom work group that are part of the National Technical Assistance Center for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, and members of the Northeast PBIS network. And some of the materials come from our PBIS trainings in that region. And so we just want to thank the individuals that are on these slides here for their contributions to these materials. Before we get going in the modules, we want to just introduce you to a couple of the elements that you'll come across as we go through this. So first, you'll have the module videos, like you're watching now. This is where the bulk of the content will be presented. You can pause these videos, you can watch them multiple times if you aren't sure about content, but that's where you'll be able to interact with myself and my co-presenter Dawn as we take you through the materials in this course. Along with the videos, you have a module workbook available to you, and there are a couple of components to this. One are some guided notes in which you can fill in the blanks as we go along. It includes the bulk of the content, so you don't need to write down everything we say, but there will be some pieces to kind of help you keep engaged and listening through the videos. And then all of the activities that we talk about over the course of these modules will be in the workbook as well. So we'll refer you to specific page numbers and specific activities in your workbooks. And then finally, for those of you who want to learn more about this content, if you're serving as a coach or if you want to just dive in deeper, we'll provide a number of readings and additional resources for you. As we go through this module in particular, you'll see a couple of specific activities. We'll do some stop and jots. These are designed just to give you a moment to reflect on the content that we've talked about and to think about how it applies to your setting. You will have a couple of discussion board posts where we'll ask you to post your observations and your questions for the colleagues with whom you're taking this course. You can respond to each other's questions and you can share your observations. We will have a couple of examples that we'll look through. We'll look at videos together as we go through this module and analyze a couple of videos. So we'll evaluate several examples. And then we'll also have some workbook quizzes in which we will walk you through a couple of quick multiple choice or true and false questions to help make sure that you're keeping up with the content as we go through. And then finally, at the end, there will be a module quiz. All of these components are truly meant as self-assessments to help you ensure that you're learning the content as we go and to help you understand where you might want to go back and spend a little bit additional time making sure that you understand how the content applies to your context. So don't feel too intimidated by any of those activities, but use them to self-assess where you're at with the content as we go and to help guide your own learning. So here's our first stop and jot. We want you to think a little bit about what you already know about behavioral support. What do you know about behavioral support and what do you want to know? And take a couple of minutes and jot those ideas down in your workbook so that we can be thinking about what those are as you dive into these first couple of modules. All right, now that we've taken a couple of minutes to think about what you'd like to learn about behavior, we want to just frame this content for you. We know that there are a variety of different people who will be accessing these modules. Some of you are pre-service teachers who have yet to get your very first job. Some of you are brand new teachers in your first 1, 2, or 5 years of teaching. And some of you are really experienced teachers with lots of experience with kids with disabilities and kids in general education. And the way each group of you will access this content changes a little bit. And so if you're in a pre-service program and you're really learning this content for the first time and you don't yet have teaching experience, we want you to focus on learning the content and the theory. Become fluent with the ideas that we present here. Look for examples in your clinic placements, and when you go into schools, look for examples of how this theory plays out. Consider video recording or asking for feedback on some of your lessons. So if you're just trying out, if you're student teaching, if you're just trying out some of these practices, once we get into specific practices in this module, consider asking your cooperating teacher or to give you some feedback on your use of those practices, or video recording yourself and self-assessing, and we'll give you some tools to do that. But if you're a pre-service teacher, think about it as a way to look for examples, practice implementing some of the skills, and really become fluent in the theory. For new teachers, you have a lot on your plates. And some of this might be familiar to you. You may have had some of this information presented to you during your pre-service program, or maybe you learned some of it once you got hired. But we want you to focus on moving from what you know to actual practice. We'll talk about this as we go through, but one of the real challenges with behavioral skills is not that each individual skill is really difficult on its own to implement. It's putting the whole puzzle together in a way that is effective in your classroom and actually improves student behavior. And so we want you to really focus on moving from your theoretical knowledge of what behavioral support looks like towards implementation. And so really think about what would be a reasonable implementation goal for yourself, and either self-assess or ask a coach or a cooperating teacher for feedback on that goal, so you can start to see whether you're able to improve your implementation of these practices as we go through. And when practice isn't working, when you try something in your classroom and it doesn't seem to be working, use your underlying understanding of this theory to modify it. So if you've got a situation where you're trying something and it doesn't seem to be effective with your students, come back to the content in these first introductory modules, think about the theory of behavior, and think about how you can modify the practice to make it a better fit for the students that you're working with and the classroom that you're working in. And for our experienced teachers, a lot of this probably will sound familiar to you, and we want you we want to honor that and recognize that, and have you think about using this content as an opportunity for self-reflection. We all have patterns of strengths and weaknesses, and all of us can continue to improve in our behavioral support for kids, particularly with disabilities, but really for all kids. So just like the new teachers, think about your own practice, think about where you've developed habits that you'd like to begin to change, and think about how you can set a new implementation goal for yourself to improve your own practice. In addition, you're likely in a role of mentoring new teachers, and think about how you can help support that group of teachers to learning these practices potentially faster and more effectively than you did when you first started in this role. So depending on where you're at in your teaching career, the way we're suggesting you approach this content varies a little bit, from just learning the theory and kind of getting an understanding all the way down to how do you help others learn it and how could you become a coach or a mentor as we go through it. But we hope this helps you think through how to approach the content. All right, so let's dive in. This behavioral course is part of a series of courses on data-based individualization for intensive academic need. And if you have not accessed those other courses, they are available through NCII. We're recommending that this behavioral course come at the beginning of that sequence, or pretty close to the beginning of that sequence, so that it can help you support the behavioral needs of your students as you learn to do intensive academic support for kids who might need that. You will see, or you have seen, this graphic in your other courses. We're going to build a very similar graphic in the behavioral courses that we'd like to walk you through here. We're going to start with the 5 critical features of classroom management, and we'll talk further about what those are as we get into these modules. But those are going to be the foundational practices that should be in place in every classroom. We'll call those kind of our tier 1 practices that need to be in place as the foundation for everything else that we're going to do. We're going to implement those practices with fidelity. We're also going to come back and adapt those a little bit later on, but we're going to make sure we've got these practices implemented with fidelity. We'll progress monitor to make sure that the students are responding appropriately to that. If they are, fantastic. We'll continue to just make sure everything is going well. If they're not, we'll need to dive in a little bit deeper and think a little bit more carefully about exactly what the patterns of behavior that the students are exhibiting are telling us about our implementation of classroom practices. We then will adapt those interventions to make sure that they meet the needs of the kids in our particular group. There are a variety of ways that we do that, but primarily when we're talking about these specific classroom management practices, we're talking about increasing the frequency, the duration, the precision of those 5 critical features, and really ramping that up until we get to a place where the majority of the students in our group are being successful. If that works, then that's fantastic. We'll just continue to monitor and make sure kids are being successful. If that's not sufficient, then we're going to go into more intensive, individualized behavioral support for kids with specific needs. That is not the content that we will cover in this course. In this course, we will take you through all of this process over here, where we're talking about getting those initial features in place, making sure they're done with fidelity, and making sure they're intensified to a place where the majority of kids are able to be successful. For more information on individualized behavioral support, we'll refer you to some additional resources towards the end of this course and make sure you have access to that information as well. But we just want to be really clear that is not the content that we are covering in this course. In this course, or in this module rather, we will go through 4 parts. In the first part, we're going to just spend a little bit of time thinking about the rationale and importance of behavioral support. Why are we spending time on this to begin with? In parts 2 and in part 3, we will break down and define some of the basic theory of behavior. It'll be a little bit of a vocabulary lesson, a little bit of a theory lesson to make sure we're all on the same page with how we're thinking about behavior. And then finally in part 4, we'll define and describe what we call the function of behavior, which is really sort of why students continue to do what they do, why any of us continue to do what we do. And we'll take you through those parts.